The Taking of Teeth. A short horror story. Written by Michael van der Voort. Narrated by Robin Reads. It was as much, it seemed to me, to quell the wailing howls of Annalise as to satisfy any true belief in her accusations that we first agreed to set about the odious task that brought us, spades in hand, to the freshly turned-up earth of the old gentleman's grave. She had come that night, wailing and slobbering into the building, screaming not bloody murder, but of murder that was, in contrast to her cries, of a more silent and insidiously serpentine form. Not that the supposed subtlety of the method did anything to decrease the volume and ferocity of her exclamations.
"Poison! Poison!"
she had called, with such repetitive ferocity that the very word must have hung upon the ears of every Pariser for the span of several streets, and continued to ring in my own ears long after we had succeeded in quieting her. Her contention, spurious as it may have been and indeed proved to be, was that her father, the late Edouard Mousson, had not, in fact, died of natural causes, but had instead been poisoned by his new wife, a woman whom Annalise clearly regarded as an intruding usurper, hell-bent upon desecrating and trampling underfoot the memory of her late mother. There had, it was true, been some speculation and loose talk about the speed with which Monsieur Mousson took up a second wife following the first's demise, and even rumours of illicit meetings and impropriety during the unfortunate woman's lifetime. Never, however, had those rumours suggested any malice or foul play until Mousson, not 6 months out from his nuptials, suddenly succumbed and joined his late wife upon those fabled Stygian shores. Now, with her accusing finger pointing directly at the new bride, whilst the other hand clutched the will and testament so recently altered to disinherit her, Annalise Mousson threw out curses and accusations as if they were blessings and greetings. The new bride, she insisted, Annalise would never deign to refer to the woman by her given name, had conspired to have her father alter his will in such a way that his accumulated fortune and all worldly possessions would be left entirely to her. She had then, Annalise claimed, concealed some flasson within her skirts, and, conspiring like Marlowe's Barabbas to infect the broth taken by her spouse, had polluted it with a venomous concoction. She had, in short, poisoned him. Whilst there was little evidence save for the rewritten will and the pertinacity of Annalise's accusations, and for our own part little motivation to do so, save for bringing an end to her interminable caterwauling, it was decided at length that the weight of suspicion did indeed hang heavy enough in the balance for an exhumation to be justified. It was therefore decided that a dig would take place the following morning, in order that Mousson's body might be re-examined, and the cause of his death more thoroughly and conclusively investigated. So it was that in the frigid grey of that sombre December's morn, myself and several other officers took the unholy steps of disturbing the soil and rousing from its eternal rest the body of Edouard Mousson. Having observed first-hand, both at medical school and during my time as an investigator, the mauling effects that the ground and worms have upon the flesh when allowed the leniency of time, I would ordinarily have approached this task with some apprehension, reluctant in every instance to look upon corruption's ruinous handiwork. In this case, however, I felt somewhat reassured by the brevity of time elapsed between burial and exhumation, and, whilst I was still chastened by the gravity of our task, I remained confident that the artifice of the mortician's brush, and the brief interval that had elapsed, would save us from any dire confrontation with the chewing maw of time, and grant us the mercy of regarding the late Mr. Mousson in a state at least approaching that in which he had lived. These hopes of preservation, however, were very soon to be dashed. Oh, what horror awaited! In the very instant that the lid was drawn back, in the very moment of its unveiling, the wretched hideousness of that visage forced the assembled party back, as they each, including myself, recoiled in disgust at the ghastly apparition that had been revealed. Worse still than the vision itself was the realization that this gruesome sight was not due to any great increase in the rate of decomposition, or indeed the effects of any poison upon the tissues, but rather to a ghoulish and deliberate act of calculated desecration. For upon prying open the lid of the casket, we were greeted not with the face of one who slept in peaceful repose, but in fact with something that was hardly a face at all. For a moment I considered that perhaps there had been some issue in the embalming, that perhaps the supportive structures or gauzes placed inside of the jaw had collapsed overnight, and that this was the reason for the hollowed-out implosion of everything from the top lip down. But again, this was not the case. The bottom portion of Mousson's countenance, once held in high regard and widely discussed by the lady-folk of the city, was now mangled almost to a rotten mulch. The mouth itself was caked with thick, red-brown gouts of the most horrendous gore. The lips, torn and shredded as if lacerated by some machine, hung in tattered flaps around the exposed gums, which were themselves swollen and plump with the purplish pink of prolonged damage. Freed from the framing curtain of the lips, they bulged and gaped nakedly forward, exposing the fact that every one of Mousson's teeth had been unceremoniously ripped from his jaw. Completing the task that we had been assigned, we lifted the limp carcass into the waiting canvas and conveyed it back to the morgue for examination. By this point, however, it was the post-mortem injuries that had excited my imagination, and for which I most keenly sought answers. Who, with what apparatus, and for what purpose, had prized open the rigid jaws of the dead and stolen all of his teeth? It was a week later that I received my answer. I had been lying in bed, though in truth for the 7 days since the exhumation I had enjoyed little in the way of rest, haunted as I was by the image of that mutilated face, the hollow, cavernous O of that open hole of a mouth, and the persistent illusion that, despite my fastidious cleanliness and the generous application of soap, water, and cologne, I could still smell the cool, earthy tang of soil and mould upon my skin, as both scent and memory lingered around me. It was just past midnight that the thundering upon my chamber door awoke me, and doubtless most of my neighbours, as it threatened in its force and instance to break the very panels of the wood. No sooner had I opened the door a crack than a familiar voice harried me to get dressed immediately and meet him at the end of the street where a hansom cab was waiting. This message, unaccompanied by any form of greeting, was barked at me as an imperative, an order not to be seen as a request and to be undertaken with the greatest of haste. Hearing it spoken by that voice, I did not hesitate, but simply turned and obeyed. I knew better than to distrust the speaker, or to delay for 1 second when time was of the essence. Seated in the cab, and still only partially dressed, I struggled with my cravat as my companion repeatedly bellowed at the driver not to spare the horses and to "Hurry, man!" The narrow back streets of Paris, running across the face of the city like a network of arteries, flew past in a blur of cornicing and cobblestones, as the hansom, more than once, leant awkwardly on its wheels as it careened perilously around a sharp corner. Only when it became apparent that the horses were at full stretch, and that to move with any greater rapidity would risk tipping the carriage, did my companion rest back into his seat, and I was finally able to inquire as to where we were rushing with such unrestrained haste. In response, my companion sighed and handed me a leaf of paper with a name and address printed upon it. The location itself was in one of the poorer quarters of the city, around 2 miles from my own lodgings. When I naturally inquired why we were heading to this location, he responded cryptically that we were going there to apprehend a murderer before he has the chance to become one. When I inquired after the identity of this supposed murderer, or murderer-to-be, my companion again replied with a clipped and direct answer. "We are heading to the abode of Arthur Laudin, the man who steals teeth." Hearing this, I paused. There had been no report of the mutilation to the press, no official documentation of the case yet published, and yet here was my companion, touching with deliberate and focused accuracy upon a case I had only recently opened. Choosing not to press him on how he had come by this information, I resolved to withhold any further questions until after we had arrived, contenting myself to instead simply watch in admiring fascination as my companion scribbled in a small notebook, scratching out and correcting whilst writing at a furious pace. As he did so, the speed and force of his intellectual machinations showed upon his face, and I could only marvel once again at the man's remarkable acumen, and wonder at what speed and in what strange intersecting orbits his thoughts were travelling. The man sitting opposite to me that night, moving with uncharacteristic agitation and still shouting periodically to the driver in an attempt to induce some frankly impossible increase in the horse's efforts, was none other than Erasmus Crane, a man whose singular talents in the field of ratiocination made him instrumental in the resolution of several high-profile cases in London over the course of the last decade. Why he might now be in France, and in Paris, of all places, I had not the slightest notion. I had first made Crane's acquaintance 10 years ago, when we had been brought together by our common pursuit of the same rare volume, and, finding our habits and interests to be well suited, had lived together for a period. Since then, I had not only moved to Paris, leaving my friend in London, but also borne witness to several demonstrations of the man's singular genius. Though we had spoken with much less frequency in recent years owing to the distance, he was a man that I considered to be both a mentor and a friend. Now, here he was, conducting his business not in his favoured London, but in my own beautiful Paris. For his part, Crane had been somewhat disappointed when I had expressed my wish to join the constabulary, a collection of individuals whom he regarded to be both ignorant and inept in equal measure. I, however, had been undeterred by his reproaches, and had satisfied myself with the knowledge that, in such a role, I held the authority to officially apprehend those wrongdoers that Crane was so artfully able to identify. Clearly it was this honour of my office which made me valuable to him at that moment. Indeed, were his methods not so unconventional and ill-suited for the constraints of a formal obligation, Crane might have fit perfectly into the organisation. This, however, was an insurmountable hurdle, as Crane was as confident in his methodology as he was stubbornly recalcitrant. Arriving at the address, I was surprised to see Crane spring from the cab and, with a vigour and agility seldom seen in a man of his advanced years, bound up the steps and begin to rap heavily upon the casement with the same thudding determination he had used on the door of my own quarters. Whilst I paid the cabby a small sum and bade him to wait for our return, I noticed a light come on inside the house, and hurried to join my associate on the top step, ready to pounce upon whatever fiend he had identified. Imagine my surprise and consternation when the heavy door was drawn back to reveal a tiny old woman, still half asleep, and muttering curses and epithets even as she opened the door. Erasmus Crane, who had clearly not come to this address in search of this old lady, enquired after the whereabouts of another individual, a man named Arthur Loudun. The woman, who turned out to be the concierge for the collection of apartments, revealed that the curious Mr. Loudun had not been back to his apartment that evening, and that she had no idea where he might have got to. Crane cursed aloud, spitting the words in a violent paroxysm of frustration and annoyance. He apologized for his outburst, bowed as he bade the concierge good evening, and, turning on his heel, proceeded back to the cab, leaving me to further apologize to the woman for having woken her and to trail impotently behind. Climbing into the carriage, I found Crane already hunched over on his side of the bench. His head was down, shaking gently from side to side. Though his face was almost entirely obscured by shadow and the bowler hat he perennially wore, his temperament in that moment was nevertheless abundantly clear. Observing the vice-like grip he maintained upon the head of his cane, the way that his hands, wrapped like talons, squeezed with such force that the cord-like sinews protruded, and the flesh around the knuckles stretched and pressed to a brilliant whiteness, it was clear that he was either wrestling with some conundrum that required the deepest and most physically demanding levels of concentration, or he was barely containing a frustration that threatened at any moment to erupt into an explosion of concentrated rage. I was to find out later that it was, in fact, both. Without disturbing him from this curled chrysalis of emotion, nor inquiring after his intended destination, I instructed the cabby to return to my own chambers, reasoning that Crane would be happy to camp there for the evening, and would perhaps be willing to offer something by way of an explanation. On the way there, Crane never raised his head once. The only words he said were hissed out with such vitriol, such a pointed, venomous sharpness, that it seemed the words themselves might have been dipped in poison, like the arrow tip of a tribesman's dart.
"The damned fools,"
he muttered.
"We're too late. Already too late."
For my part, I said nothing, and instead simply sat back, watching from the window as a pale blush of watery pink coloured the Parisian dawn. I knew better than to press Crane. Inviting him into my home, I directed him towards the study, and, once seated, allowed him the time he needed in silence to remain in the meditative state of private contemplation into which he was immersed. It was curious to observe him like this. Like an insect or tortoise retreating into its shell, he seemed to have turned almost entirely inward. Even as he had ascended the stairs, I could see that this internal wrestling had a clear physical manifestation, and that he seemed even to walk with difficulty, as if the steps interrupted this process of coiling and curling himself around his thoughts, nestling the few kindling embers of an idea and shielding them from any outside interference until he succeeded in making them ignite. In the meantime, I busied myself with the lighting of an actual fire, and Crane offered his sole acknowledgment in the form of an appreciative nod when the flames finally began to catch and shadows danced upon the wall. An hour later, I looked across to see that this same fire had provided some comfort and gone some way to thaw the icy glaciers and pitted fissures of Crane's furrowed brow. His demeanour also seemed to have warmed sufficiently that he was able, after a short interval, to explain his frustrations and the nature of his strange errand.
"I believe," he began, apropos of nothing at all, "that a few days ago you and your colleagues took the first clumsy steps upon a road I have been travelling along for quite some time."
He removed his hat for the first time and ran his fingers wearily through slicked back strands of silvery hair.
"You stumbled upon a cadaver which had been unceremoniously stripped of its teeth. Is that not correct?"
I sat up in my chair and leaned towards him, nodding to confirm his assertion, whilst also wondering how it was possible that he had come by this information in the first place.
"Before you make the obvious enquiry, no, I have not had access to any of your internal documentation, nor do I have any moles or spies within the organization willing to provide me with information about ongoing enquiries, save for yourself, of course."
I raised a smile here, though I confess I was still suspicious that Crane might have an informant within our ranks.
"In truth," he went on, "had not you and your colleagues arrived with shovel and pickaxe when you did, had you, for example, delayed for another hour, you may well have found an even greater mystery in the form of an empty grave."
I regarded him closely, trying to follow his slowly uncoiling line of thinking.
"I believe that our friendship provides me sufficient largesse to be honest and admit to you that had you not arrived at that moment, I would have beaten you to the task. I had planned, not 1 hour after you removed the body, to conduct my own investigations by exhuming old Mousson with the intention of examining his jaw. As it would happen, the focused precision of my plans were disrupted by the ramshackle stumbling of your own."
Crane was, of course, correct that we had in no way intended to stumble upon the dental mutilation, but rather that we had been conducting official business, and I was somewhat alarmed to hear that my friend would have gone forward with his plan to execute an unsanctioned exhumation solely for the purposes of uncovering such a crime. "I am quite sure we did not mean to step on any toes or impede your progress, Crane, but you must admit that the business of the constabulary takes precedent over your own private inquiries, and that the investigation of a possible murder supersedes any case of post-mortem desecration, I replied, not a little defensively. Even before I had finished, however, Crane was already shaking his head.
And would you not agree, dear friend, that the prevention of an actual murder supersedes the investigation of an imagined one?
Here, for the first time, Crane showed some glimpse of the wit and good humour to which I had become accustomed, and even allowed the faintest shadow of a smile to play upon his lips.
I am assuming that the inquiries around the supposed poisoning of Monsieur Musson bore little in the way of actual fruit, and that, though the disinherited daughter continues to scream, no evidence to confirm her suspicions has been found?
On this point, Crane had me, and I was forced to concede that he was correct in his assertion. There was no evidence of poisoning.
I see. And, as a price for this pointless exercise in digging up the dead, your organization may inadvertently have endangered the life of some other poor soul, and allowed that lunatic Laudin to escape into the night.
Here he shook his head, holding his open hand before him as if weighing some invisible object.
Even when faced with the evidence, they have allowed themselves, just as they have before, to become distracted and ensorcelled by the grim realities and sensational features of the case, whilst ignoring the finer and more important details. For me, as an interested observer, it appears always that the shocking crimson of the scene has blinded them to the obvious by painting their eyes all over with red. Now we shall be forced to wait until evening to apprehend the suspect, and even then only if his instincts prove to be in line with my calculations.
Here I was forced to stop Crane. Whilst I had been pleased to indulge him so far and to allow him to exercise his acid tongue upon the good name of the constabulary, I felt that this indulgence had reached its limits, and told him that if he was to continue in such a fashion, the least he could do was explain his grievance plainly and without secrecy, elaborating upon how and why he considered his own methodology and investigation to be superior, and what action he intended to take to see its aims come to fruition and the suspect apprehended, adding the perhaps unnecessary barb that a crime, even one as severe as murder, is not a crime until it is committed. The man you suspect is not yet a murderer, and so, therefore, could not be charged with such a crime, nor is he at this point even a suspect in any ongoing investigation. Crane sighed, and, leaning back in his chair, steepled his fingers beneath his chin. Then, after a few moments in silence, he retrieved from his pocket his pipe, and proceeded at length to explain.
It is true, I confess, that Laudin is not yet a murderer, or at least so far as we know. However, the purpose of the constabulary, as I understand it, is to prevent crime, not simply to police it after the fact. If, as in this case, there is a strong indication that a man shall be driven to such lengths, then I would consider it entirely reasonable for the constabulary to detain him, if only to halt this spate of desecrations and unsanctioned exhumations of which he is assuredly guilty.
Here I became interested, not only in the forcefulness of his assertion, but with the numbers. "Spate of desecrations?" I repeated questioningly. Crane smiled broadly and lit his pipe.
As I suspected. The mauling of Mr. Musson was your first encounter with such an incident?
I nodded in confirmation, as Crane, sighing, reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced an envelope, clearly stuffed almost to the point of bursting with folded documents and newspaper cuttings. Selecting an example at random, he handed it to me. The story from one of the evening gazettes was a report on the continuing mystery of the 7 heads. In it, the reporter explained how in the last 4 months, 7 separate heads, separated from their bodies, had been found in curious locations across the city. These heads, stumbled upon by citizens, had variously been found in a farmer's field, on the steps of a municipal building, under the boughs of an ancient oak tree that stands by the shores of the Seine, and resting, as if in repose, on a churchyard wall, amongst other venues. Quickly scanning over the words, I glanced back at Crane. "I was informed of this case," I muttered quietly, still searching the article for further details. To my understanding, there was no actual case to answer. The owners of the heads were identified as recent victims of the guillotine. That much was clear from the nature of the separation. The explanation I was given was that the heads, along with the bodies, were not buried to an adequate depth, and that dogs, looking for a meal, had dug them up and carried them to other parts of the city. This would account for why the discoveries were made within such a small radius. In all likelihood, a single dog or a pair established a habit of digging up these remnants and were attempting to store their prizes for later consumption. It's gruesome, but...
"But,"
Crane interrupted,
"your account omits a crucial detail. Once again, the constabulary, blinded by the macrocosm, has missed the unifying detail. In every case, the heads that were discovered were missing the teeth."
I sighed heavily, realizing in that instant that this unifying detail, which had clearly been overlooked, was in and of itself a great and undeniably clumsy oversight.
"In every case, the teeth had been removed post-mortem using a pair of pliers."
Here, Crane produced a number of plate daguerreotypes. How he had obtained access to these photographs, or had been granted an opportunity to photograph the severed heads himself, was a mystery, but the grisly images did indeed confirm his assertions. In each case, the lower jaw was dislocated, whilst the entire area around the mouth was rendered a mangled nest of tattered flesh and ragged, open wounds. The flesh of the face was pitted, the skin imploding inwards as holes and cavities in the jawbone were created, and cratered depressions around the philtrum caused by cracks and splits in the bone allowed the skin, taut with rigor, to slacken and slide into the spaces.
"My curiosity was initially aroused by the appearance of the heads themselves when the number rested at 4, but when I observed this common unifying element, the artless extraction of teeth, I suspected immediately that something deeper and far more sinister was afoot. This action, this performative ritual of removing teeth, clearly undertaken by someone with little experience of pulling them from living patients, is a compulsion, a driving urge that this individual clearly needs to satisfy. When these reports hit the papers, it seemed that the tooth theft had ceased, however. This was not the case, nor could it be. This individual, now in the thrall of his compulsion, like so many ensnared by the writhing curlicues that rise from the opium pipe, to seek out his thrill at any cost. He is an addict, and will not stop. Having had one source of satisfaction denied to him, our man was always going to find another. It was then simply a matter of determining where he would find it. Having examined closely the photographs of the first 5 heads, I was, through my own private channels, afforded the opportunity to examine the 6th and 7th at close quarters. What I found when examining the heads was a means of identifying the culprit.
Crane laid the photographs upon the small side table, and invited me to again look at them as he explained his reasoning.
The key to unlocking the identity of the midnight dentist lies not in what was taken, but in what remains. In the early cases, the teeth, though extracted, were not always fully removed. With such amateurish technique being applied, the crown would at times shatter or break during the removal, meaning that fragments remained embedded in the jaw. Slivers or even entire sections of the root or pieces of enamel were left behind. In every case, these fragments, descending pendulously like stalactites, were on the right-hand side of the tooth structure. Similarly, when one observes the lacerations to the lips caused by the violent force with which the teeth were extracted, we see a recurring pattern. Often the lips are split and torn, but always, in every case, in a curved crescent pattern that moves counterclockwise and shows signs of more pressure at the start of the incision and less at the end. What this clearly demonstrates is that the motion used to extract the teeth was done in an awkward, overreaching fashion, a twist counterclockwise that can only mean that the culprit was left-handed.
"Here," Crane said, signaling me to stand and passing me one of the photographs.
"Hold your hand as if clasping a knife or a pair of pliers. Try to twist it, and follow the pattern of this laceration whilst holding the instrument in your right hand."
I did as he asked, miming the action and attempting to trace the same crescent curve. The action was possible, but difficult and uncomfortable. It was not an action that I would undertake were I attempting to gain the massive amounts of leverage necessary for the removal of a tooth. Crane, seeing that I had come to agree with him, nodded triumphantly.
"Now,"
he said, whilst raising his middle finger,
"whilst the incisions and the remnants of teeth show the culprit to have been left-handed, there are other telling details that help us to narrow our search still further. Here,"
he said, pointing at a marking high on the side of the head. The mark was black, and looked to me like an ink stain.
"This is bruising, caused not by any impact, but by the blood still within the tissue pooling in a particular area. From the location of this bruise and the fact that a matching bruise can be found on the other examples, we can see that the head was, for some considerable time, stored upside down, and that the blood, drawn by gravity and robbed of the oxygen provided by our living, breathing lungs, which gives it its livid crimson colouring, pooled in one spot and blackened the skin. The specific location of the marking, high on the forehead and temple on one side, shows that when the head was stored upside down, it was also held at a slight angle, tilted to one side. If we assume that the period during which the head was held in this manner was during conveyance between locations, carried perhaps in some satchel or bag, we can also deduce that whomever carried it is in possession of an awkward, tilting gait that leans heavily onto one leg, favouring one side over the other to the extent that the bag, slung over a shoulder, would also slightly lean to one side, causing the latent liquid within the severed head to pool in the same place on each occasion. From this, I reasoned that not only were we looking for a man, I assumed a man owing to the brute strength necessary to extract the teeth, who was not only left-handed, but who had reason to favour one side of his body over the other. Now, whilst these details provided me with clues of the culprit, they did not, as I desired, reveal his location. For this, it was necessary to fancy oneself within the mind of such a deranged individual, to see, as it were, through his eyes. Where, I asked myself, now that the leavings of the guillotine would be closely guarded, could someone readily come by the vestiges of the departed? Where could one have access to both the bodies and the time necessary to perform these actions? Over the next 3 nights, I visited every churchyard within the circumference of the area in which the heads were discovered.
For a moment I feared that Crane had already taken the step of exhuming bodies and was on the very cusp of admonishing him for such an action, when, anticipating my question, he raised an open palm to reassure and stop me.
I did not, at this stage at least, have any reason to disturb those who had gone to their rest. It was not the state of the dead that interested me, but rather the actions of the living and the tools with which they undertook those actions. With the aid of a skeleton key, I was able to intrude upon the storerooms of each churchyard and make a thorough examination of the tool sheds. In each case I examined the shovels and picks used by the men charged with digging the graves. In only one, the very churchyard from which you plucked old Mousson, did I find a shovel upon the handle of which there was erosion primarily on the bottom right of the shaft, suggestive that the firmest grip was taken by someone left-handed. This same shovel also showed considerably more wear than any of the others on one side of the blade, as if, for some reason, there was a greater amount of weight applied to this particular wing of the blade than any other. I had my suspicions as to why this might be, but I required confirmation. It has never been my habit to lurk in the churchyards or creep between the walls of crypts, but on this occasion I deemed it necessary to do exactly that. Taking up a position with the widest possible view, I decided to wait until dawn. As soon as the sun began to paint the sky, affording me enough light to make a proper investigation, I stole across the length of the churchyard, seeking out the newest and most recently dug graves. Through careful examination of the soil around these plots, I was able to confirm my suspicions. In every case, the footprints that were to be found in the disturbed soil were matched by a smooth, concave indentation within a 2-foot measure of the bootprint. These small craters in the ground surrounded the graveside, suggesting that whoever had made them had not simply remained on one side of the grave, as mourners are wont to do, but had completed an entire circuit of the plot, presumably whilst filling in the grave. Not only that, but they had done so only on one leg, the rounded indents in the dirt having clearly been caused by the smooth, blunted end of a wooden leg fashioned to a rounded point rather than to resemble a foot. This quirk of the anatomy in a gravedigger would also account for the markings and extra deterioration of his spade, not to mention the leaning gait that would have created the pooling in the severed heads. Seeing those craters scarring the face of the soil, I knew at once that I had my man. And so I waited. Waited for the following evening, when the only one-legged gravedigger working at that cemetery was to be on shift. A burial which just so happened to be the interment of the famous and infamously unpoisoned Mr. Mousson. In order to confirm beyond any doubt that this individual, whom I learnt from locals in the area was named Laudin, was the perpetrator of these crimes, it was necessary for me to observe the entire process. I knew at what hour the burial was scheduled, and that it would most likely be that very evening, before the grave was filled, that Laudin would complete his gruesome undertaking, something which, regrettably, I would be forced to allow to happen if I was to confirm beyond doubt that this was our man. And so I waited. I retired to a nearby cafe with the intention of returning in the late evening, when, with the help of 2 hired hands, I would disturb the lately laden soil and prove my theory. Of course, what I had not suspected was that my own designs would be preempted, and that you and your entire sad carnival would parade into the scene and disturb my well-laid plans. Now, Laudin knows. He knows he will be suspected and will likely abandon his workplace, which means also abandoning his supply and source for his prized possessions. However, cutting off this supply will not stop him. He needs to act. He has to act. He needs to take the teeth, and, sadly, as surely as night follows day, if he cannot attain them from the dead, he will move on to the living, advancing as naturally as does a caterpillar to a butterfly, from acts of desecration to acts of murder. We can only hope that before he is able to complete this action, my assumptions about the man's behavior and habits ring true. We have one more chance, but we must, with focused agreement and unity of intention, act as one tonight. What else could I do but nod to confirm my agreement? As evening approached and we settled at the agreed meeting point, Crane elaborated upon his thinking. When waiting for Laudin to begin his work digging the grave for Mousson, I observed that he arrived 3 hours early for his allotted shift, not through any desire for speed, but because the assigned task simply took him longer. At this point, he has not developed the physical strength necessary to offset his disadvantages. This is a crucial observation. As he spoke, Crane looked past me, onto the street, the spaces between the trees, catching and watching every movement, hoping to catch a glimpse of the villain on his approach. Laudin's affliction means that he lacks both the speed and strength to tackle a fully grown man. We can see from the way that he struggled with the dig that he does not possess the physical attributes necessary for this task, and also that he is aware of this. It is therefore far more likely that any attack he might make upon a living person will be upon a woman, and moreover on a woman who is frail, or in some way diminished physically. Those in thrall of addiction, those driven by compulsion to act, will always take the easiest route to satisfying their hunger. They are impulsive, they are opportunists, and they value expediency above all else. This is their greatest weakness, because it makes them predictable." As always, Crane was proven correct. Around 10 p.m. on that very evening, the constabulary, with assistance from an interested member of the public, were able to apprehend the grave robber Arthur Lodin, although by that point we were also confident of charging him with attempted murder. Lodin, in a sequence of events predicted and anticipated in almost every detail by Crane, returned, in the face of all good sense, to his apartments, where he was caught in the very act of attempting to attack the concierge, an elderly woman, frail and somewhat diminished physically, with the very spade that had enabled Crane to identify him in the first place. Safely ensconced in a nearby room, we had forewarned the old woman and had enlisted the help of 2 constables, who, similarly concealed from view, were able to pounce at the precise moment that Lodin raised the blade above his head, swinging with the murderous intention of bringing the sharp metallic edge down upon the dome of the old woman's head, splitting her cranium like a coconut. By midnight, we had not only charged Lodin and stowed him safely into a stone-walled cell, but had received his full confession, detailing how he had extracted the teeth, what he had planned for the old woman, and with the acute vagueness shared by all the madmen, some partial account of why he had performed these grisly mutilations in the first place. Whilst it might have been expected that, with the suspect in custody and the matter for all intents and purposes closed, Crane and I could have considered ourselves triumphant and have celebrated a job well done. However, the strange events following Lodin's arrest meant that no such congratulations ever took place, nor could we fully reconcile ourselves to the idea that the case was entirely closed. Firstly, there were the mutterings and calls that came from Lodin's cell, words that from his second day in incarceration onwards were lisped with the hideous rasping hiss of one who has had every tooth removed. Unlike those upon whom he had operated, Lodin's extractions were performed whilst he was not only alive, but conscious. Arthur Lodin, in a fit of the most acute agitation, deliberately smashed every one of his teeth to pieces by biting down on the stone ledge of his heavily barred windows. Having collected the shattered fragments from the ground, he offered them to the attendant guard, giving instructions for him to take them to the oak tree by the Seine. When questioned about this act of self-mutilation, Lodin was emphatic. He screamed and howled with the ferocity of an animal, repeating over and over that we did not know what we had done or had unleashed by arresting him.
When a child in its bed, he hissed, is snatched, yes, snatched in the night, when its teeth, tiny innocent milk teeth, are ripped and torn from the mouth in a single yanking wrench, when nothing is left behind, nothing but a twisted nest of blankets and awful blood-stained sheets. Bloodstains and sheets. Then you will see what you have done.
When I asked him to explain, to tell us what it was he believed we had done, he clutched his head in his hands, clawing at his scalp and howling with the furious incandescence of a fiend.
I killed no one. No one was hurt, he screeched. I hurt no one. I took from the dead. Yes, the dead, because the dead don't feel. They were the dead. If I don't provide on time, they will just be taken, with nary a care from whom, living or dead. They shall just be taken.
He then returned to screaming with the agony of the damned. The only time the wailing stopped, and even then only for a moment, was when I asked him outright what he did with the teeth he stole. For a moment he seemed to calm, and, smiling a strange, toothless, awkward smile, he approached the bars and whispered softly,
What did I do with the teeth, you ask? It's simple.
He hissed as the smile abruptly faded, replaced by a look of absolute sincerity, and words that have haunted me ever since. In answer to the question, What did you do with the teeth? Arthur Lodin answered coldly,
I fed them to it.
Whilst I know that most would consider these utterances to be simply the ravings of a madman, feverish inventions of a troubled mind that have no real basis in reality, there is nonetheless something in the phrasing, the intensity with which Lodin delivered the words, with a mix of frustration and terror, that forced those words to remain with me long after he was moved from custody to an asylum. Whilst I would, of course, love to forget all about Lodin's strange warnings, the recent actions of my friend Crane did little to ease my mind. In a letter delivered to my desk around a month after we arrested Lodin, Crane explained that he had sought out the tree to which Lodin was referring, and found that, within the local area, it was afforded some special significance, bordering upon reverence. This tree, an impressive and stately old oak, it seems, was regarded by the locals as one of the many dwelling places of the Fae or fairy folk. How this archaic mythology bled into and influenced Lodin's own troubled thoughts is anyone's guess. Crane, however, remains, as always, not only a man of science, but also a man of caution. In his letter he explained how, for the last 3 weeks, he had made a brief circuit of the butchers, tanners, and abattoirs in the local area, and had, through some negotiation and the payment of a small but trifling fee, secured a weekly supply of specially prepared waste products from these grim sources. He went on to explain that every Sunday since, he has arranged for a young boy to make the trip out to that fabled oak with the intention of depositing a small pile of these waste products before it. These teeth, canines, molars, and the oversized incisors taken from the skulls of cows, horses, and pigs he places carefully atop the surface of a tiny wooden door that Crane had uncovered between the roots of the tree. A door which, he assures me, remains locked from the inside. This has been The Taking of Teeth, a short horror story, written by Michael Vandervoort, narrated by Robin Reads. Copyright 2023 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.